Good morning. Thank you so much for bearing with me for the technical difficulties going on. My name is Mae-Lynn Germany, and I'm a counseling and psychology doctoral student at the University of Memphis. And some of my interest in speaking with you today is I've had an interest in grief and bereavement research for quite some time, and more recently have sort of shifted to focusing on non-death grief, and a lot of that looking at the meaning-making literature. But when I saw a chance to come and present at Personal Construct Psychology Conference, I thought that seemed like a great opportunity to learn how to infuse more personal construct theory into my work. So whenever we get to questions, I'm really eager to hear some of your feedback on how to infuse more of that into our work. And basically, this is more of a theoretical presentation, not really at a phase like where we're collecting data. So looking at just how these concepts kind of apply to anxiety and loss and transition. And specifically looking at anxiety and loss and transition in the coming out process of transgender individuals. So are there anybody in here who's done like any clinical work or any research like with transgender clients before? Okay. So we have a couple of people that have done some work. And so given that it may not be something that we're working with clinically, I always kind of start out with talking a little bit about like language and establishing a common language to talking about gender and gender identity. So whenever we're talking about trans, like sometimes you may see trans with this little asterisk by it. And what that kind of denotes is that within trans identity, there are multiple ways that one may identify or express, and that trans is more of this umbrella term that refers to those people who may transgress societal gender norms. Those people who self-identify as transgender may exhibit some behavior, traits, or appearances that fall outside of their gender or their birth or sex expectations. So this may kind of manifest as individuals who are biologically one sex but dress or present as another. This could be individuals who don't subscribe to or conform to any gender standard, being either dichotomously male or dichotomously female. Individuals who live their life as a gender that does not match their birth sex and have undergone some form of gender reaffirming surgery, whether that is hormones, breast augmentation, or full gender affirming surgeries. And Sam Kellerman does this really helpful blog to kind of blog and illustration to demonstrate what some of the differences are. So when we say gender and when we say sex and when we talk about sexual orientation, how do we kind of parse apart like these different concepts and constructs, because a lot of times they're very intertwined for us. Gender identity would be that internal sense, so your head sense of where you fall on the continuum of like woman or manness, that's considered separate from biological sex. Gender expression would be that external appearance, that how you present to the world, how you would like to be perceived. This could be, you could have a heavier endorsement of like a feminine gender expression or a heavier endorsement of a masculine, or maybe it's a combination of both. In terms of biological sex, when we say sex, we're referring to those basic characteristics, so whether those are considered like female, male, or a combination of the two, which would be considered intersex. And a lot of times we also talk about gender as being kind of intertwined with sexual orientation. So a nice way to distinguish the two are gender identity being who do I go to bed as, and sexual orientation being who do I desire to go to bed with. So not necessarily dependent on how we identify, but often discussed that way. So Dr. Heidi Levitt has done some work on looking at how transgender individual, or through qualitative interviews, of how transgender individuals like construct identity. And some of the more dominant themes that were found are that gender was seen as both like essential and kind of constructed and very kind of personal to the individual, instrumental in communicating needs and values. And for many individuals, they noticed like some sort of like freedom in being able to express and identify outside of this quite rigid like dichotomy. So it was also a helpful construct kind of emerged of considering gender as both or neither in some of the trans narratives. So as I was going through and learning more about personal construct theory, it's one of the concepts that seems to kind of stick out to me and very helpful in understanding where some of the feelings of loss, threat, and anxiety come in, is when we adopt kind of the person as scientist perspective of recognizing that even early in childhood, we try to make sense of the world as we experience, and we're constantly forming and testing out these hypotheses about how to be. And so by the time we're adults, we have this pretty complex model of the world and our place in it. So particularly when we're walking around in the world with a particular expression that fits like my gender identity, it may feel very good internally, but also can feel a bit unfamiliar if by the time we're transitioning or one is transitioning in adulthood, we have this complex model of this that's pretty set of how to kind of exist. So when you come out and when you transition, you're experiencing shifts in power and privilege and learning what do I do with this newly found power? Or maybe if you're transitioning from male to female, of recognizing the ways in which you had power once societally, but may no longer experience that in your particular space. So there can be a bit of doubt and insecurity because it kind of ushers in loss of predictability that I'll get to in a moment. But at a very early age, we learn who is and isn't like me. In fact, if you reflect on maybe gifts that you got during Christmas or clothes that you were bought or allowed to wear, like from parents, there can be pretty serious like expectations of, I remember one time even for Christmas for myself, to add to the believability of Santa, my parents bought a toy car for me, but I was instructed very specifically, it's not for you, this is accidental. So sending a very small message of there is, even down to the toys that we play with, is a right and wrong way to present or to be. So this creates a number of gains and loss experiences when one is coming out of transitioning. And I always, when I'm presenting on this, like to emphasize both gains and losses, as there may be, to focus just on gains may reduce the space like for grief and further disenfranchise one from their own grief response or perception of loss, and to focus on loss solely reduces one down to just a loss experience, not recognizing the gains that may be reached. So there are a number of tangible and intangible changes as one comes out and transitions. These can be losses of familial relationships, but they could also be gains in intimacy or sexual satisfaction. You may have gains and losses even in economics or financial status, as if you're in one of the qualitative studies, someone described that when I transitioned to and came out at work as a man, I eventually got paid a good bit more, whereas some trans individuals reported significantly less or a drop in financial status. There are also a number of intangible changes. So these are like gender-related privileges that I've kind of described, racial privileges and identity. So one man in one of the studies was describing that how the intersectionality of race and gender, and how as I transitioned, or before I transitioned, if I expressed anger as a Black woman, it was quite different than if I had expressed anger as a Black man. That societally, with where I live, expressing anger as a Black man becomes very dangerous. So recognizing an additional layer of stigma and additional loss of privilege. But one of the biggest loss experiences has been, or that I've noticed, has been with loss of predictability. So when moving from, particularly in a Westernized society where we view gender as being very dichotomous and very steeped in biological essentialism, to an identity that is more fluid or occurs in a more liminal state, ushers in a loss of predictability, not only for the individual that's going through a transition, but for the social supports of the individuals that interact around them. So this challenges, or likely challenges individuals, particularly with a very constricted view of gender and these rigidly defined constructs. And transitioning may exist as an invalidation of core constructs, basically meaning like, so there are men, there are women, this is how the world works, so I don't even have to reconsider it. But as you're watching someone transition or encountering someone who's transitioning, or even transitioning yourself, can be a challenge to those core constructs. And Dr. Levitt writes that, which I thought was very eloquently put, that those who challenge gender norms challenge one of the most fundamental bases of power in Western society. So when one cannot confidently identify another's gender, he or she lacks information about that person's social status, which can cause confusion about how to interact with the person, judge their behavior. And so transgender individuals and even social supports can experience an almost Kellian-like anxiety and leading the individual to feeling great social pressure at times to conform to one side of the gender binary or the other. So the three concepts that I pulled out that felt most salient were threats, so the imminent change of more superordinate constructs of superordinate or core self constructs. So when you're suddenly aware that your constructs aren't working as well, you experience a type of anxiety. And when you notice that there's great change, it ushers in kind of this feeling of threat. So for example, actually I recognize I didn't introduce this term earlier, but when a person, when you hear cisgender, that typically means that my gender identity, the way I express, matches like my biological sex characteristics. So for example, I would present or identify as cisgender. But back to the threat piece, cisgender people experience being largely unaware of transgender experiences and having even the existence of transgender identity feels a bit threatening. And in some of Dr. Levitt's work, many of the participants described that they may regulate gender expression of not knowing how to anticipate the reactions of others if I will be reacted to with hostility or aggression, and having general feelings of unsafety of having to learn how to titrate and compensate for others' loss of predictability. And this can also be helpful in understanding identity separation, particularly for internalized, in terms of internalized prejudice. So for trans individuals, if the trans identity is construed as being incompatible with an existing self-construal, and that kind of exists as intolerant, then and they construe themselves as maybe moral or lovable, but it's not congruent with that identity, the person may attempt to separate self from a more trans identity. Also noticing that guilt can be, which feels a bit separate from regret. A lot of times individuals may say if you're feeling guilt, then that must mean that you regret transitioning, when actually viewing it from a more Kellian sense, that guilt can be a fairly normative reaction when one is not living in a way that fits with your core constructs. And so the first time that an individual may dress in a way that feels so congruent for your internal sense of self, but it's not for Halloween, it's not for some costume party, it's me presenting my vulnerable self to the world, there can be a bit of guilt or ambivalence that comes up from that. And then hostility. We can definitely recognize hostility not only towards the self, but then hostility recognized even in a societal way. So hostility being a matter of insisting that your constructs are valid despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And so how this can kind of emerge in, as one is transitioning. A great example in America, I don't know how it is in other countries, but in America we have bathroom laws, and it's a huge controversy right now of who can use what bathroom. Do you have a right to use what bathroom you identify with? Is it dangerous? And so this is a great example of hostility, of saying that yes, we recognize the trans identity that exists, and yet it doesn't fit with the way that societally we conceptualize gender, so it's a forcing of constructs. And then also, even on an individual level, an individual may have some sort of self-hostility, a feeling that for me to lean into my trans identity is too much, and so I'm going to force myself to present in, let's say, a very masculine way in an attempt to force me to exist in a way that I am known and that people are able to predict me. And so some of my interest kind of lies in relating this hostility, threat, and anxiety to what's been described in the literature as ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss is talked about a lot with families who have a loved one who's transitioning, have a loved one that's transitioning, and it's kind of this back and forth between presence and absence. So is the person that I love, is the person who I've come to know as like a father, brother, son, are they the same or are they different? Are they present or are they absent in my family system? And we can also apply this concept too if we think of the multiplicity of selves, with aspects of selves. If they're really bound in this gendered role, which pieces of myself are in and out of my self system? What's been found is that socially prescribed meanings tied to gender roles can still result in feelings of loss. So this may be loss of heteronormative and cisgender visions for a child's future. Heterosexual, those are both the same. Go on to the next one. Loss of normalcy and security, so kind of speaking to that loss of predictability. And as I said earlier, the presence and absence piece leads family members to feel that it's sort of a contradictory loss, because you are still physically present, in some cases still physically present here, but psychologically absent or removed. And in this qualitative study, Norwood found like 4 large meaning-making themes of the way that people make sense of transition, 2 being those that really elicit a stronger grief response, and you'll see that the constructs in them are much more constricted than some of the others. So the first was titled Replacement, and one woman says, I recently lost my only other brother to cancer and feel as if I'm losing my other brother. I cannot think of him as a sister. So having such a hard, the construct being so tight that I can't, this violates some of my own like core constructs, and it's seen as being replaced. This person is essentially dying. And similarly for removal. My soul was shaking in my body. The next few years, I had very intermittent, very difficult contact with my parents, partially because I felt I had been betrayed, partially because I felt as if my father had died, but was still there. So again, kind of getting up to presence and absence. And it was very confusing. I didn't have any sense of closure. I don't know who this person is anymore. And then other individuals who see the transition coming out as being more of a revision or evolution, so making meaning of it in a slightly different way. So I thought, this is more than a tomboy. This is more than a lesbian in the making. This kid's confused. So I sat on the edge of the tub and said, listen, Rosalie, that was the name at the time. You're a beautiful person and you're a wonderful person and I love you deeply, but you are a girl. You have a vulva and a vagina. You're a girl. Jared, Rosalie's brother, has a penis. He's a boy. As if that's what makes us a boy or girl. That's what I thought then. So really seeing throughout her meaning-making experience with her child that it's so steeped in biological essentialism, and then dilating the construct somewhat to where she can now see her child and the gender that they identify with. And lastly, evolution. I won't let him deny that this was his past. This is who he was, and it will always be a part of him. But for me, it has to be an evolution. And evolution doesn't mean that the past goes away. It means that's where you started from, and this is where you are now. So being able to dilate, again, some of the, or make meaning. And I recognize, that's right, you. Okay, so I'm probably not going to get through the meaning making, meaning reconstruction and loss, but I'll try to just hit some of the high points. So if you are working with trans clients, thinking, what would be most helpful, what to kind of take away from this, I'm pretty fond of leaning into the meaning reconstruction literature, so helping individuals adapt to loss by construing a new reality, and this may require like shifts in their assumptive world and helping to make meaning of those core constructs that weren't validated. But in the bereavement literature, there are 3 ways that have been shown to be highly successful when working with a variety of grief and loss instances, and this is through like sense making, benefit finding, and identity change. And it's cautioned to kind of use these in the immediate wake of loss because it can appear quite invalidating. But by using these approaches like benefit finding, maybe some of those gains that we talked about earlier of like finding a sense of community, increased intimacy like with partners, and identity change. I also want to say this isn't like changing the individual's identity and saying, okay, this is how you need to identify, or this is the categorization that you need to fit in. It's more of helping recognize changes in your identity, that resiliencies, or what some of the literature may call like post-traumatic growth, of what are the ways that you have changed as a result of this event. And then also some suggestions of exploring through meaning making and gender. But if anyone is interested in the slides, I'm happy to send them to you, but also want to open it up for questions. I'm happy to answer questions, as well as my lovely advisor, mentor, and instructor at the same time. Thank you.